By end of spring, the family's money woes were increasing. Mary befriended a manager at Vandekamp's bakery on South Figueroa, who let her have their day-old baked goods. The family had burned every bridge in their path during the previous year and a half. Tensions escalated, particularly between the women. Charlie needed the girls to attract the men, and when the girls weren't getting along, that was a problem. Manson may not have needed to take care of the women's emotional well-being, but he was still responsible for their material needs. He could steal for their supper and encourage them to do so as well. Breaking the law meant rejecting conventional society, which bonded them more firmly to his lifestyle. Brenda took special pleasure in robbing her own mother of several pricey fur coats. The women cut the furs up and used them to adorn the dune buggies. Her theft inspired Manson. Charlie started taking the kids on what he called creepy crawls, Gypsy explained. He'd say, "Get your black clothes on, get in the car, and do a creepy crawl." You snuck into someone's house and moved things around. He was actually getting them used to committing burglaries. They would silently break into middle-class homes, barefoot and dressed in black, and either take food or just move things, furniture, objects of art. The goal was to leave no clear trace of home invasion, but rather to confuse the homeowners. They didn't pick locks or break windows or anything obvious. The intention was to sneak inside and have fun during the middle of the night while the residents slept, leaving only a slight trace of their activity. Later, they also stole small valuables that they could easily pawn. Most of the women participated in the creepy crawls. Leslie admitted shamefully, "I only did one. My father's. I robbed my father's house." From a letter Brenda later wrote to Squeaky, "I had some bolt cutters I used to cut locks off gates. I really got a big charge out of it, too, because I used to get locked in rooms when I was little. It took me a few times to get the hang of this bolt cutting. You have to put all your weight on the cutters at once, and the lock breaks in half. When we came to the locked gates, I'd hop out and cut the locks." Filmmaker John Waters developed a fascination with the family during their trials, later befriending Leslie Van Houten in prison. He wrote, "Was Manson's dress rehearsal for homicide, known as creepy crawling, some kind of humorous terrorism that might have been fun? Breaking silently into middle-class pigs' homes with your friends while you are tripping on LSD and gathering around the sleeping residents in their beds, not to harm them, but to watch them sleep? When the Mansonites went further and moved the furniture around before they left, just to fuck with the waking homeowner's perception of reality? Was this beautiful or evil? Could the Manson family's actions also be some kind of freakish art?" Campy fascination aside, Waters makes a good point. The family creepy crawled initially as a recreational activity. It wasn't about crime. It was theater, macabre theatrics. But it wasn't harmless, and it wasn't meaningless. They didn't break into homes in the ghetto, after all. Their creepy crawl missions feel aspirational in retrospect. They're looking for something. They're preparing, even if the perpetrators don't know it. Their forays into suburban homes eventually do result in grand theft and worse. They begin to desire not just the possessions of these affluent American homeowners. They eventually want their lives. Even the younger teens started to bitch about the rich piggies. Their glances into middle-class homes only served to remind these young women of what others had and they had not. Their isolation on the ranch, their hunger, Charlie's lack of success at fame and fortune was causing everyone to despair. That despair escalated into a heavier dependence on drugs. As Susan wrote, Manson was becoming hooked. By the time he settled at Spawn's ranch, The family sometimes reached up to as many as 40 people, counting the hangers-on. Just providing enough food became a project. You can imagine what the expenses for drugs were. By the summer of 1969, most expenses were financed by drug deals and auto theft. Charlie may have believed that Tex and Sadie were starting their own drug ring that season with speed. He didn't want the family using speed, although he tolerated the bikers' use of it. Watson hid the speed. But many have wondered, what exactly was Manson himself using that caused, as Susan claimed, for him to become addicted? Neither marijuana nor LSD create chemical dependencies. The family were acquainted with a man named Charles Melton, sometimes known as Blackbeard Charlie. He lived in Topanga. Later that summer, the family met a new follower through Melton, but in April, he visited Spawn Ranch. Melton, a mystical, far-out dude or Dharma bum, wore a long beard. When Tex saw Melton's facial hair, he commented that he wished that someday Manson would let him grow a beard. But Watson, despite the pressure he felt to live up to Manson's rules, was never under anyone's thumb. He only became a fixture at Spawn Ranch after he blew out his mind on Belladonna. According to several people, Tex turned mean and pushy after that bad trip. Tex was not a follower of Manson. He came and went as he pleased. He dated women who were not in the family. He set up his own drug deals, often without Manson's involvement, and once, famously, without thought to the domino effect it would create. That was the July 1969 drug burn of Bernard Lotsapapa Crow. We will get to that in all due time. The first week of May, Greg Jacobson and Dennis scheduled another studio session for Manson. It went disastrously. But Jacobson mentioned filming a documentary about the family. He believed in Charlie and thought the film might spotlight his talents. Jacobson explained Manson's charms. His rap was solid. He had this charm of throwing 10 things at you, and while you're still working on number 3, he's at 7. He'd bend down, pick up a handful of rocks, and throw them in the air. They'd all come back to him, and he'd look at you and say, "Throw it all away, and it'll come back to you." But even Jacobson witnessed Charlie's bad moods. I remember once he held a gun to my head and said, "What would you do if I pulled the trigger?" I said, "Well, I guess I'd die." He really liked that and just put it back in his belt. Strange as it sounds, I loved Charlie for pointing that gun at my head. Jacobson reached out to NBC Studios to pitch his documentary about a hippie commune living above the Hollywood Hills, and NBC was intrigued. Jacobson also called Terry Melcher, who agreed to hear Charlie outside of the studio, where he'd be more relaxed. Melcher arranged to visit Spawn Ranch a week later. Bruce Davis arrived at Spawn Ranch before Mother's Day and was elevated in rank, now handling the stolen credit cards and fake IDs. Manson worried that George was plotting against the family. Spawn later claimed Charlie once forced him to sit in a chair for several hours while he held lit matches in front of his face. He also threw punches in his direction, never actually hitting the elder man. Finally, after 3 hours, the door opened and Spawn heard Manson depart. George remained seated in the dark, afraid to move. Finally, he reached out with his hand and found Manson's head. Charlie whispered, "I'm still here, George." New Spawn Ranch hands Lawrence Giddings, aka Larry Bailey or Little Larry, and John Swartz both enjoyed time with the family. Many of the family men also worked on the ranch in some capacity, in the stables or around the property. It blurred the line for this author as to who was a family member and who simply liked to hang out with Manson and the women. There were people arrested during raids at the ranch, now known not to be family. On May 18th, Melcher and Jacobson visited the ranch. Melcher later testified that on that visit, he and Charlie discussed the primary holdup to a contract, Charlie's unwillingness to join a music union. Melcher suggested a friend who could record them in his studio van, a way around the union system. Melcher called the man, who agreed to record Charlie. On May 20th, Clem was arrested for grand theft auto and released. Seriously, it's like the Keystone Cops were on duty. On the 21st, Charlie phoned his parole officer and asked for permission to travel. He said he was going on tour with the Beach Boys. The parole board wanted a letter from the band as proof, and Charlie got all bent out of shape. He said it would jeopardize the tour to even ask. A few days later, Manson grumpily informed his parole officer that the tour was off.